3, 2, 1. Panel, let's be clear. There is only one form, one valid form of inquiry, and that is the empirical method, otherwise known as the scientific method. Empirical inquiry is the only thing throughout the entirety of human history that has proven anything close to a useful result in the pursuit of the betterment of humanity, of improving our living conditions, of creating new technologies that improve our lives, and of arriving at ideals which serve as the foundation of society. To that extent, we reject every level of the notion of the non-overlapping magisteria. There is only one form of inquiry, and it is the only valid one. Now, I will note, a priori reasoning, the use of logic to deduce ideas, can also be valid, but it is valid only as a foundation for empirical inquiry. The questions that philosophy, as fascinating as they are, and as much as I love using them in the debates, are useless if they make the world a tangibly worse place for the people over whom they bear power. I'm going to tell you, I think this debate breaks down into exclusively 2 clashes. The first is, are there areas of knowledge to which the scientific method does not apply? The answer is no, but I'm going to explain why. And the second one is a rather tedious one, but I guess one we're going to have to deal with anyway, which is, does accepting this idea bridge the otherwise enormous gulf between the scientific and the religious community? Let's begin. Firstly, the scientific community, I think, encompasses an admittedly broad range of people, but I think they can all be categorized broadly under one umbrella and then subcategorized further. That umbrella is as follows. In the same way that a philosopher is a lover of knowledge, a scientist is someone who pursues truth. Someone who pursues truth that they can prove through the use of the empirical method. That is to say, they can make observations, they can analyze those observations, they can apply laws and trends to those observations, and critically, they can predict things in the future. It is useless for anything other than intellectual circle jerking to analyze things that have happened in the past and explain how they happened in the past. It may be entertaining, it may be informative, history may be something that you study or that you enjoy, but if it's an idea or a concept does not inform us in order to make predictions about the future, it is worth less than the paper it is written on, other than entertainment value. That's the unique value of the scientific community, and the people who participate in that are numerous, but they are united by that same belief. I think it encompasses PhD students like myself, otherwise academics, people who work in the private sector doing science, people who work for governments in terms of policy, or just people who like to watch YouTube videos and learn more about the world. All of these people, I think, have a duty to advocate for the truth that I espouse, which is that the empirical method is the only one that produces tangible benefits for the real world. The second point here is, I think the problem is that this would be fine in a world, this motion wouldn't be so problematic in a world where that truth was accepted, but it's not. The public already have a distorted view of what is and isn't science, and it is unfortunately not aligned with the idea of empiricism, that is to say, the observation, the collection of data, and the making predictions. The critical piece in this is that predictions have to be falsifiable. That is to say, a prediction that cannot be disproven is worthless. If I tell you that there is a teapot hidden behind the moon, or the sun actually would probably work a bit better here, right? If I tell you there's a teapot hidden behind the sun, and you say, no, there isn't, you just made that up, and I say, but you can't prove me wrong, I have wasted my breath, and you have wasted the time that you spent listening to me, right? So the consequence of this is, unfortunately, though, the public operates under that paradigm. They think that so long as something can't be disproven, or hasn't been disproven, it at least might have some merit, even if the concept itself cannot be disproven. I think I'm going to start with the impacts of what this has meant within religion. The first thing is religion, to a large extent, a lot of the harms that it accrues are when it runs counter to the belief in the scientific method. The rejection of evolution and the people who were literally burnt at the stake or whatever else for espousing scientific views such as the Earth is at the center of the universe, those acts of the rejection of the empirical observations and the scientific method set back human progress in a way that cost lives, in a way that damage, the progress of society towards enlightenment values, whatever. In the modern day, this manifests in ways such as faith healing. It manifests in things like conversion therapy, in which scientists tell you there is no way you'll be able to pray away your cancer, but religious people say, but you don't know that for sure. Now, I appreciate the scientific community adopting this is not going to fix that immediately. But note, in the context of my previous argument, in which we operate inside a field of public discourse, in which the public who are not scientists are being assaulted on the one hand by the naive belief that religion might have some value in its predictive power when it does not, and on the other hand, scientists advocating for an alternative message. For scientists to concede the ground that religious people never will would mean that the public now has a view that is skewed in the direction I think would be harmful to society. It becomes a lot harder to reject something like conversion therapy, in which you electrocute gay people in the belief that this will cure them of their sinful views, when scientists themselves cannot stand for the uncontrovertible truth that if something cannot be proven to work and cannot be proven to make people's lives better, then as a consequence, it should not exist within society. But it spills over even outside of religion, right? Because the problem is, once you make this concession that there are other valid forms of inquiry, that means that a variety of other incredibly damaging and incredibly toxic beliefs that pervade throughout society and are causing material harm to people's life. I'm talking about homeopathy. I'm talking about the anti-vax movement. I'm talking about people who won't wear a fucking mask when they go to the supermarket. Okay? All of these people operate under a rejection of science and a rejection of data. To the point where the scientific community says, no, but there are other ways to arrive at truth, that means that now every instance in the future will be pointed to by this. That's why it has to be an absolute and overriding consensus by the scientific community. Any crack in that armor will be exploited and will be leveraged by people who seek to undermine the scientific consensus. I'll now take a POI from closing.
That's philosophically a very interesting discussion on truth. Can you empirically prove that you love someone?
Loving someone is not a form of inquiry. It is an emotion that you experience. Nothing in my argument said that religion does not have value in its experiential form. It can be incredibly cathartic for someone to be religious, but that does not make it a valid form of inquiry, and therefore the scientific community should reject that at all levels. Lastly then, on the interaction with the religious community and why maybe they'll argue that it would be useful in order to get religious people to be more accepting of science. I would first note that there is a critical difference between the underpinnings of religion. That is to say, they are based upon faith. They are based upon the idea that so long as you believe in something, it can be materially valid. That is false, and that means that they will never accept, the hardcore religious people will never accept what the scientific community has to say on this matter regardless. That what we instead talking about are the people who are not fully sold on either idea, but instead could be swayed in either direction. I do not think that a lot of people who are anti-vaxxers base this upon religious beliefs, but to the extent that people are often open to different competing worldviews or to different accounts of what a valid inquiry is, I think it is important that scientists maintain a rigid wall of defense of the empirical method and do not concede that there is any other alternative method, because to do so would be to concede ground to people who espouse views which are actively damaging to society. So in summary, I think we should utterly reject any idea that truth can be arrived at with anything other than the predictive power of empiricism in order to continue fostering the progress that we've made as a society thus far. Propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I invite the leader of the opposition to start the case for the opposition side. Hear, hear.
Cool, can I check that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool, and yeah, I consent to being streamed. 3, 2, 1. Keris and I both went to Catholic school. Both of us had science teachers within Catholic school. Our science teachers probably believed that Adam and Eve were the first human beings to ever be born on Earth. But our science teachers also engaged in the same type of inquiry to try and teach us the scientific method and to try and teach us the real world that they experienced around them in conjunction with the faith that they internalized within them. Note that the cognitive dissonance to consider both science and your faith happens all of the fucking time, insofar as any faithful person who ever takes an aeroplane has to reconcile the fact that there actually isn't a heaven above the clouds, but rather that there's loads of machinery and satellites flying above there. Literally, in order to survive as a faithful person in the modern day, you necessarily have to engage in this cognitive dissonance as some form of survival mechanism. I think the example Hamza gave in the Manchester final I judged him in was the idea of a Muslim gynecologist, right? Because at the point that people have to engage in this tangible reality and they have to mitigate the internal tensions that they feel when trying to reconcile their faith with this, there is necessarily going to be a path of least resistance whereby you engage in this cognitive dissonance to say, look, both of these things are equally valid and provide different forms of experiences and inquiry, whereby I am able to engage in my internal inquiry in terms of how I relate myself to the world around me and in terms of why I am here and what my purpose is, whereas I am additionally able to relate myself in terms of the tangible experiences I have and the products of science that I encounter. We think that at the point that OG massively misconstrue this characterization by creating a rigid division between those who are scientific and those who are religious. They necessarily miss the important actors whereby anybody who is religious has to encounter the products of science. Because note that it is probably an uncharitable characterization to say that these people are those who are trying to pray their cancer away. We think these people probably don't change. We think these specific metrics that you should judge this debate on are the internal reactions to those within the scientific community who have to try and reconcile two differing value systems and the capacity that the scientific community has to engage and reach. Those are the two metrics that you should judge this debate on. Before that, two extraneous responses to opening government. First of all, on how they miss the comparative, because the comparative is not necessarily the modes of inquiry by which you engage in terms of I engage in one or the other, but it is rather in terms of if I am able to engage them at all. That is to say, it is probably reasonable to engage in both forms of inquiry simultaneously to derive differing values and experiences from them. We don't think opening government have proven mutual exclusivity. We think at the point that I prove that people engage in these dissonances all the time, we think this is when I take this. But secondly, note on Ron's material of rejection of science, and note that this rests on a premise that there is a direct link between scientific progress and societal progress. I don't think opening government have proved that, and so far as the reasons why people reject science are probably cultural or political. See that the people rejecting the idea of wearing the mask is because they feel like their freedoms are being constrained, rather than they feel like they are rejecting the specific scientific method. I think at the point that is true, opening government have missed the comparative and they do not have a case. How then does this affect the individual? I think our crucial contention from opening opposition is that at the point where the scientific community tries to perpetuate their narratives to those within it, necessarily anybody who has some degree of religious faith value system has to try and exist with an internal tension between the faith that they relate themselves to after they die and the science that they encounter at the point that they are alive. Because here's the thing, right? Note that you encounter scientific facts on a daily basis that are necessarily always going to be at odds with your faith. See my framing. At the point that you are able to engage in this dissonance as a survival mechanism to reconcile your faith with reality, you are able to derive a lot of good impacts. Because here is the thing. People are always going to value themselves internally and what their value systems they hold, and people are always going to wonder what's going to happen to them after they die and what science is unable to prove. I think at the point that you shut off that mode of inquiry from them, necessarily this is something that science doesn't necessarily have the same capacity to prove, and you lock people out of being able to conceptualize what is going to happen to themselves when they no longer have this earthly presence. I think the important thing to note then regarding the individual is that people view themselves in relation not just to what they encounter physically, but in terms of how they relate themselves spiritually as part of a grander project. At the point that this is true, you need to allow people the capacity to reconcile this, because at the point you no longer allow people to engage themselves in this, there is specifically the anguish of always questioning which value system you should be applying at any one time. Am I wrong to ever adhere to my faith? Am I wrong to discard my faith for science? The crucial differential at the point that you say both of these things can exist is that you have the ability to make adaptable decisions suited to your preference at any one time and not being imposed by the wider scientific community. That is to say, you are able to live the closest conception of what you consider to be your best mode of life at the point that you make adaptable decisions not imposed by the scientific community, that you make value judgments in a specific instance, whether you want to adhere to your science, your faith, or some combination of them at both times. We think at the point that people possess multiple value systems and operate on multiple axes, you are unable to live a conception of a good life if you apply this imposition on them that forces them to be unable to make this value judgment. We win in the clash of the individual. Why then science? Why do we win on science? Because note here that there are specific benefits of scientists engaging in in spirituality. You find community, you find internal solace, you find the ability to like have some drive forward that gives you a purpose of what you're doing. You have the capacity to get new religious scientists on board at the point that you don't act antithetical to them. And here's the crucial thing with regards to the rejection of science that Ron talks about. Science is rejected at the point that it is considered antithetical to the value systems that people hold dear. I think at the point that vaccines and shit are seen as an unnatural imposition because they are seen at odds with religion, this is when the narrative says things like these should be rejected. At the point that you allow people to reconcile these things, these are when they become less afraid of science. This is when optically science is no longer a threat to your existence, and this is when you get a reciprocal relationship of scientists exploring religiosity and religion exploring science at the point they take it aboard them. This means that we win OG's religion clash at the point we prove it is no longer a threat, that scientists no longer suffer this internal tension, that people engage with science. Stand with all.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to continue the case of opening government, I invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Cool, please give me a sec. I'll sort out my timer. Let's make one thing extremely clear. Even as a law student who has lack of scientific knowledge or any sort of deep religious sentimental experience, I think this debate is not about if people can have contrary views and bypass their own respective cognitive dissonance. The question is whether we should concede the competing modes of inquiry to achieve truth at the end of the day. 2 points of clashes in this debate. The first is the purview of scientific inquiry. Secondly, whether there is a necessity for bridging the sort of divide between scientific and religious community. I think on the first clash, the burden on us or the scientific community that they push on us is to call upon the scientific community to describe and concede that there are areas of knowledge in which the scientific knowledge does not cover, in which there are, in simpler terms, there are areas in which science our observations of the world that is not rooted in empiricism. Ron has given you two important arguments in this regard. The first is to provide you principal defense of the ultimate purpose of scientific community in the contribution to the human experience. That is to say, science gives you material good. They give you some sort of advancement in terms of how it preserves our own physical and mental safety. It tells you how, the extrinsic circumstances might affect us objectively. Those are the literal objective advancement that we have made. The second observation coming from Ron is that in our world, we deter any unconstructive critique from religion, which damages all of these consequentialist good. I would add 3 extra reasons to why this purview of scientific inquiry should be bounded in this particular set of boundaries. The first is to say that the methodology for scientific analysis is non-cyclical. That is to say that an X proposition is tested and a determination is made to see whether Y conclusion could be met. Religious analysis literally trips us up because it is tautological. It is based on your subjective experience that no one can effectively contest. This is dangerous for all scientists, including those who are on the fence, who believe there is some sort of faith that they could abide by, or dodgy fringe scientists who can now make reference to this analytical method to reach their own scientific truth and then expound this in the public to say this is how the scientific community operates. I think this is a mode of bad faith, and this disrupts all the sort of good advancements that science community has achieved for the past, for the human history. But secondly, I think that scientists are more likely to reach a stage of self-restriction. That is to say, in their world, you give scientists a legitimate credence to back off from areas that they might not feel courageous enough to explore, or it might be incredible, difficult scientific area to examine. Because when, and these sort of include questions of where are humans actually originated from, or why do we scientifically behave in certain ways? A dual mode of inquiry validates a non-empirical critique. And it is far easier for, firstly, for scientists who wants to, preserve their own reputation and say, aha, I won't inquire into this because religious, because there is a higher being or there is extrinsic stuff that I cannot analyze, I would stop here. Or in which they're pressured by sort of religious critique to back off from researching from anything deeper into their inquiry. But let's assume that scientists are now able or like courageous enough to voice about whether they agree with this dual mode of inquiry or not. I think this further divides the scientific community unnecessarily, because now you're forced to categorically evaluate and make a determination of what area is divine and what area is scientific. I think given the individual interests that scientists might have individually, or the fact that they might align themselves with some of their peers who are more influential in the academic sphere, a disagreement is far more likely to occur, and it massively shifts the core focus of the scientific community to this very abstract question, which has no resolution at all. Compare it to a case in which we can focus on more important issues such as like what sort of scientific technology or ethical guidance we should bound ourselves by in the near future. I think those are the more important questions that scientific community should address. The pushback coming from open opposition is an accusation that we miss the comparative. Literally, if you listen to Ron's speech carefully, the comparative is given to which you cannot exercise inquiry concurrently, because the notion of science is you can objectively observe things. Once you defer your decision-making mechanism to a non-conclusive subjective experience, you empower everyone, including scientists themselves, to self-doubt. Look, I think we sufficiently won this clash, and for any other teams to beat us, they have to prove why science in itself is bad and how they would mechanistically ensure science to improve in the long run. And before I go on, closing?
If your past 5 minutes of the defense of the empirical method is accurate, do you think any critical or feminist scholarship about science being based on inherently male assumptions is illegitimate?
Sure. I think the reason of how productive criticism can occur outside the house is to say, look, science, the research methodologies in an empirical, but the way we conduct our biases and also like how we are informed by our decision-making process is far more likely to be achieved outside the house. When you rationally criticize how people reach decisions, when you criticize the logic, the empirical logic that scientists deploy in their sort of research. So I don't think that claim stands. The second clash in the debate is whether there's a necessity to bridge like the sort of divide between scientific and religious community. As I've said in my intro, there's no positive duty on the scientific community to do so. If anything, I would posit religious communities, especially the most religiously conservative, they would not change their minds anyways. I think Ron's analysis have shown you why scientists are demonstrably conceding and these sort of advances when they have made historically, such as like vaccines. I think this is critical because this consensus is already achieved, where even religious leaders right now cannot openly discourage people not to take them up. The impact on this side is perverse and pervasive, because kids in developing countries like Philippines and also Africa will not take up vaccines right now because they are compelled to take them up by the religious leaders because their parents are influenced by such a narrative. But second, the pushback coming from them is to firstly say, religious community gives you some sort of material comfort and therefore there's some utility intertwined with it. The first response to this is uncomparative claim, because religious realm still retains that autonomy in our world. They can still tell the believers to seek console and appreciate the higher being to live meaningfully. They can claim what you think, but that does not mean that they necessarily arrive at the universal truth. And secondly, I think this debate should be assessed on a utilitarian good, which means that the health, safety, longer times, like lifespan to experience more in life, mitigating actual sufferings from individuals matters. The potential best response that could come from them is to elevate that characterization and to say you cannot assign positive value to religion, which Sierra's case hinges upon. I think this literally misses the point, because as long as scientific value is detrimentally and destructively diminished, you actually render scientific value a negative value, which creates an asymmetry power value between two sort of modes of inquiry. And finally, I think we win on the side of the house when people are more likely to assess a sort of self-reflective, psychological mechanism when they actually have to decide between two modes of inquiry. Immensely proud to propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to close off the debate on the opening tables, I invite the deputy leader of the opposition. Here.
All right, I consent to be streamed. Can people hear me? Thank you. Okay. I'm going to start off this speech with a bit of reframing, and then I'm going to move on to like some direct responses and some rebuilding. I think largely DPM has responded to very little, because fundamentally, we are still being fed an assertion that the comparative is universal scientific adoption, when Jason's analysis explains very clearly that the outcome is more likely to be that fundamentalist religions maintain their harmful beliefs, and there's just like no delta here. I think the necessary avenue for these actors who engage with religion, which is like most of the world, the necessary way in which they can access scientific analysis is to hold multiple cognitively dissonant frameworks by which they view the world. And this is what the motion brings us. Okay, first on a quick response, I'd like to talk a bit about what happens when you die. So I think this is an interesting point. I think I'm glad that it was brought up, because I think it's legitimate to engage in the truth of now. I think it's legitimate to try and reassure yourself in the unknowable uncertainty of after you die. And I think that we're kind of misunderstanding the utility of truth and it as a non-instrumental good. Okay, firstly, I'm going to clarify our alternative a bit more, then I'm going to talk about impacts. Okay, I think why is this cognitive dissonance likely? I think because it already occurs. We've already had an example, like Catholic science teachers that believe in evolution, but like go to mass every week and they agree that the Adam and Eve story is real. I think this happens organically. I think that all humans do this to a varying extent. I think this is as opposed to a view that there are like two frameworks to view the world, a scientific and a spiritual, and only one must or like can be chosen in a given situation. I think this is more likely that most people will adopt it because most people engage in cognitive dissonance to some degree. Okay, I think how does this reduce internal tension for irreconcilable beliefs? I think decisions now are made based on the pleasure, the utility, or the practicality of their use, with no regard to a dichotomy of contradicting frameworks. I think the initial decision of which framework to approach a choice with is just completely eradicated on our side. Now, why is it important to eradicate this tension? I think now it is firstly possible to adopt hybrid belief systems and consider both logic and spirituality in decisions. And then I think secondly, our main source of tension, i.e. like what framework should I use to approach the decisions I make, is eradicated completely. It becomes easier to make decisions that have contradicting reasoning behind the decision-making process, and it becomes easier to like hold irreconcilable beliefs. Okay, I think we need to talk a bit about how this internal tension benefits people a bit. But first I'll take a POI from closing, if they have one.
So ontological truth as defined by the scientific community is not necessarily determinant of all truth. Given that you've just tried to redefine the metric into subjective truth, you're not clashing the actual validity thing, you're just attempting to redefine the instrumental end of it.
I think this, again, this is largely an assertion of like what it means to like hold truth. I think we're happy to accept a high burden that it is perfectly acceptable to make a decision that's based on mistruth, so long as that decision results in the maximum utility, maximum pleasure, and least amount of internal tension or internal conflict possible. I think this is the most like positive outcome for everyone, the outcome in which most people are like most happy. Okay, how does this removal in internal tension benefit spiritual people? Because I think this is probably the most important actor in this debate. We hear an assertion coming out of opening government that like certain fundamentalist people will just simply never adopt a hybrid like belief system. I think this is untrue, just like practically, because we see examples of this happening all the time, that religious people will adopt conflicting views. But I think that there's also some very clear analysis as to why this is likely to take place. Because now that decisions can be made on the basis of practicality without having to make a trade-off of wholly abandoning your entire spiritual framework, religious people, through this mechanism of cognitive dissonance, can access the material benefits of scientific developments that previously would have been inaccessible to them. These benefits are accrued for like things that already exist, and religious people already like do participate in this kind of thing, like allowing children to participate in a scientific education while you are Christian, or allowing like a Catholic girl to get an abortion while you are Catholic, or like allowing women to be educated when you live in like a culture where the religion says that should not happen, or allowing like a gay person to stay a member of your local church because you just think it's a good thing and you don't really care about like the logical concessions you have to make make. I think a level of cognitive dissonance is necessary for any spiritual person to access these benefits ever. I think at the point at which you will never remove the entrenchment of spirituality in culture, community, education, and identity in the world, none of the benefits that we hear from OG will accrue if like these religious people refuse to adopt a hybrid framework, because fundamentally these religious views are just ridiculously entrenched, and you will never realistically get them to completely like abandon these beliefs. Okay, I think, how does this then, I think, benefit people who interpret the world through a scientific framework? I think the short answer here is that accessing spirituality without experiencing like an excruciating internal tension or having the urge to go on like an asshole atheist tirade in your local church is probably a good thing. But like, why specifically is this good for us? I think the first point here is on community. I think we live in a society where the fundamental glue uniting many communities is a shared spiritual identity. So most people must participate in some measure of spirituality to exist at all in a culture and maintain the relationships that are tied to that culture or community. So for example, if I stop going to like Easter Mass every year, I would miss out on the important familial and local relationships that I only reinforce when I participate in a common cultural religious ritual with them and have an existing tie between my identity and theirs. Why is community really important? Humans are social creatures. They thrive off these like communal interactions. This is why like isolation is a form of torture. Why is it so good? Because we avoid loneliness, because we have more emotional and material support systems, we have better like mental health, and we get more fulfillment out of our existing relationships. What else benefits me as a very logical person choosing to engage in spirituality? Well, there's many mental health benefits. Firstly, we see a reduction of dread resulting from mortality. As was mentioned earlier, death is unknowable. This can result in like incredible amounts of existential dread, but my existential dread is soothed when I am able to engage in cognitive dissonance and use a framework that has like a soothing and comforting answer for me. I think I also have reduced grief when I experience bereavement, because I can soothe myself and say, okay, well, my relative is going to a better place. I experience more ritualistic time of self-reflection through prayer. I have like a relaxing, comforting, and soothing ritual. For all these reasons, proud to pose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to open the debate on closing tables, I invite the member of government. Hear, hear. Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to introduce the last team into the debate, I invite the member of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Hey, can you hear me? Awesome. I consent to being streamed or filmed. I'm really sad the opening opposition to Hamza's Manchester case, because we were going to have a lot of fun with that argument. But luckily, what it does allow us to do is claim the very clear impact in this debate, because I think it's strange that in a debate about the scientific community, no one thus far has questioned who the scientific community are, what they're like, why they'll do this in good or bad ways. And that's something which we're going to co-ed the hell out of from closing opposition, because I think it will be done terribly. If the scientific community would all represent their beliefs in the language of opening government and closing government, maybe this would be different. But the ones who are going to get the most capital for doing this are the commercialized, outspoken public intellectuals. Think Richard Dawkins, think Cam Harris, literally the people doing this under the status quo, who claim to A, represent the scientific community and opening government, or both government teams, sorry, now give them legitimacy, or B, say it as part of the scientific community but get disproportionate visibility because they already have commercial mechanisms to be platformed to the public. These kind of people have incentive to do things in a terrible way, which is alienating, which is disenfranchising, which pushes people away from science and gets the most important impacts in this debate. Before I go on to that, two kind of points of engagement. First of all, quickly on CG. First of all, just to point out, they've set themselves such a high burden because you have to believe beyond any doubt this is the absolute truth. And I think on that basis, their case is kind of hung on something which, did fairly cast doubt on. But secondly, I just want to compare the principle that it's legitimate to prioritize utility over truth. For example, in closing opposition, we support lying to people for national security purposes to stop people dying. We support government lying for public health purposes to also stop people dying. We think it's not enough for closing government to say truth is an absolute obligation. They have to weigh that obligation against competing obligations. I would say the scientific community have equal unique capacity to save lives, and therefore that is an obligation we should prioritize, such that it's not just they should tell the truth, it should also be about utility. The second point of framing, this is the first piece of extension actually, but I'm using it to rebut both government teams because both government teams are contingent on we should tell people the truth and let's get good impacts because we can convince them. I'm going to say it's impossible to be successful with this narrative. Opening opposition say that they say you can have cognitive dissonance and therefore people can believe both. We're going further by that by saying it's impossible to convince anyone of government team stance because science can always be explained through religion, but the converse is not true. What does this mean? Religion is an expanding tautology. What this means is whatever new evidence comes into existence through science can be explained through God. I, as a scientist, can disprove Adam and Eve myth by saying there are big processes of evolution, it's very complicated and technical, it's all scientific. And then the religious person just responds by saying, whoa, God is so clever, God is so intricate, I can't believe God did this. Any single scientific evidence you can give to someone, that's evidence that God thought beyond you, like God thought so much more, particularly given the belief in religious communities. And this isn't just like fundamentalists opening up this frames, this is just like your moderate religious people believe that God has destiny, right? So God obviously designed for you to find out this scientific fact because he's unleashing his plan to you. I think that's particularly important because it means you can never win this discussion and convince anyone when the metric is logic, which presupposes a frame of reference that religious people don't have because they can always explain your logic through another frame of reference, which is science. This is massively important because then you don't get any impacts at all on government because people can just explain what you're telling them in another way, but the other harms are important. I think a second mechanism for this is that religious people, the reason why you still get important science on our side is that religious people are trained to be scope sensitive and support different things in different contexts, right? Because you're literally trained to think of ideas like the end time. You believe that you're in God's time, but you don't know what's coming after, or you do know what's coming after, but you're not part of that yet. You know things like you're facing the apocalypse at some point and the world as you know it is going to change. This means that religious people uniquely are always trained to discredit their own frame of reference because they know that God knows better across all time and space, which is something that they can't adjudicate because they don't have they have epistemic constraints which God doesn't have, which literally means when you have like scientific discoveries that saves people, they explain that through being like, wow, God has made this new invention which is going to save people. He obviously, we were destined to find this, so obviously we should engage with it. That's the mechanism that was missing from opening opposition about why you get positive benefit between religion and science, because religious people are already presupposed to explain science through religion and therefore are likely to accept it, but also it's impossible to convince them otherwise. But let's move on to the bulk of the extension, which is how the scientific community actually do this, because I think that, just think about it, like the main books on this just now are called The End of Faith and God is Not Great, right? The kind of people who are able to get the platform to do this are the ones who have podcasts, who have books, who have visibility. So even if all the scientific community and all the like rational, neutral, like cool, not non-controversial people say this, the ones who people are going to listen to are the ones who are much more edgy, who already have a public platform, already have a public buy-in. The thing is that as soon as you have an interest in making a public platform or making statements on a public platform and you have commercial interest because it's your own like support following that is intrinsic to that, you then have commercial reasons why you're likely to say it in ways which are particularly inflammatory, which aren't as neutral and perfect and like kind of respectful like government. Some of government wasn't that respectful, but as neutral as governments tried to be. That's why you're likely to alienate people, and it's likely to become feeling like mockery and directly harsh criticism because government cannot fiat that the way this will be interpreted is in the neutral way they want to talk about. I think if the scientific community are endorsing the kind of narrative which is put forward by radical people who claim religion is stupid and dehumanize religious people, that legitimizes those viewpoints, which has incredibly harmful impacts. Critically, these kind of public intellectuals are the people who will get platformed because they have the incentive and the capacity which other more neutral scientists don't do. This is a lot of harms. Before I explain the harms, opening government, sure.
Yeah, I don't give a fuck how Richard Dawkins implements this in a shitty way. Our stance was never we have to attack religious people at all levels. It just means when they use your own logic of, but God can also explain this, we counter with the question, cool, but what falsifiable predictions can you make with that explanation?
But no one follows that. Like the scientific community says this, Richard Dawkins points to that, and literally a lot of what I got from all the scientific jargon was like there's no other legitimate way of inquiry except science. So when the scientific community says that, when Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris say this explicitly, openly, and on lots of platforms, that's the narrative that people internalize, which has all the harms. One, polarizes discussion. The religious right feel incited because they are incited, because the criticism is incredibly disingenuous, because you're not being charitable to opening opposition's like characterization of like you can have both. So this you don't get good faith between the scientific scientific and religious community, so you lose all kind of mechanisms to get the good positive benefits of science, like vaccines in the developing world, by the way, which literally saves life, like we want to talk about. Secondly, it's a recruiting tool for the religious right, because now you can legitimately be like all scientists are radical atheists, because even though you cloak it in like rational language like that, the way it's interpreted is like your religion is delegitimate, which was the stance of all of government, by the way, being like, this is not a logical way to think about the world. It's incredibly easy to spin that in a way which is saying all scientists are right to get you because they don't believe in you. That particularly means you get disengagement in the scientific community. Like, why would I want to be, if I'm like a strong Muslim, why would I want to be a doctor if I feel like the whole scientific community thinks I'm rational for believing in something? That's where you get much more fragmentation and you remove engagement with science. Also, because it means if you're, you know, a Christian a Christian, and then you go to a doctor and you feel like they don't believe in God, they distrust you, and you know that your logic and your worldview is entirely diametrically opposed, because that's literally the stance of government, you trust them less, you buy in less, you're not going to engage with them because you don't think there's any way that they can go together. I think this makes discourse around religion significantly more toxic, significantly more polarized, which doesn't leave any cooperation to get all the positive benefits which the scientific community can offer to the world. We should help people in religions rather than mocking them and making them feel like their viewpoint is illegitimate. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I invite the government whip to close up the debate for the government side. Hear, hear. Thank you very much for this fine speech, and for the last speech of the debate, I invite the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I consent to be streamed. My government's been after me for the past few years anyway. Okay. I think opening government makes some interesting claims about truth, and closing government couches them in the language of duty. How does this compare against our extension? Let me give you two personal anecdotes. It's really fucking difficult being a doctor in Pakistan if you live in a Muslim society, because what happens there is that people consistently question your scientific beliefs in line with your religious beliefs. But right now you get away with it because there's an unspoken agreement that these are two different modes of inquiry. The person that you are in the mosque is very different from the person that you are in the science lab. Opening government collapses this distinction and says, in order for you to be in the lab, you cannot be in the mosque. I just think that the impact of Kira's extension, that you have less doctors in the developing world because they are forced to make the most horrible personal choice they've ever been forced to make in their lifetimes, has to be weighed against any of this philosophical nonsense. The second case study I give you is about a Muslim doctor working in the NHS. Right now, they won't say it in front of his face, but when he's in the cafeteria in the back, they'll say, oh yeah, he's the nut who believes in God, etc., etc. I think you legitimize racism against every single religious minority in the developed world, the point at which you say the thing that you believe is so stupid that you shouldn't even be part of the field of medicine or science anymore. I'm happy to engage on the philosophical stuff. I'm about to unbox their Freshman 101 anyway, but before I do that, I just want you to weigh this against one, literally doctors pulling out in the developing world under their force, two, legitimizing racist stereotypes against religious minorities, and three, literally no religious community greenlighting vaccines for kids again, because now all scientists are atheists. I just think any other impact in this debate has to be weighed against three horrible propositions. Let's talk about truth. The first thing I want to question is what is truth? Because our understanding of truth is very interesting. Truth is truth, which is to say that truth is whatever you see in the world. It's unclear to me why that's true, because there's also belief-based truth. I think anything that I believe to be true is true. It's extremely unclear to me why one is better than the other. But secondly, I say, equally importantly, our argument occurs upstream of this discussion of truth insofar as we say, even if our theory of truth is the same as your theory of truth, we can justify it within the frame of religion. How do you do that? I discovered evolution. This disproves Adam and Eve. Oh, no, it doesn't. That's what God meant in the first place. He's fucking smarter than both of us. I discovered that it wasn't a Big Bang that created Earth, not God. No, it was God which created the Big Bang. It's an ever-expanding tautology. So even if we buy their theory of truth, which I don't see any reason we should, we still win because you can justify the belief of truth in this way. The third thing that I say here, which is very important to point out, is with reference to closing government's duty argument, which is that you have a duty to truth. One, it's a circular argument insofar as if what you're saying is that what scientists believe should be what their duty is to espouse, then if there's lots of religious scientists, then it's unclear to me why this is their duty to espouse this. But let's agree that the duty is towards truth. And they analogize this to courts. I find this fascinating because I think justice is intersubjective. That's why Pakistan has a death penalty, but Germany does not. Our mediation of justice depends on what the community wills to be justice. Similarly, our mediation of what is truth is what the scientific community should will to be truth. But again, let's take them at their best, like opening government. You have a duty to truth. I think the best way to fulfill the duty of truth is to spread truth. You stop spreading truth when you alienate the people who most need that truth to begin with. The Muslim doctors I talked about, the kids on those religious communities I talked about, and doctors across the developing world that I talked about. So even if your duty is literally to spread truth, you are falling far short of your duty because you've created an institutional framework where it's been impossible to espouse truth and impossible in any way to push truth. Before I get to the second part of Kira's extension, I'm very happy to take opening government, either one of you.
So let's concede, I don't know, in your best case scenario, maybe you win the short term. Let's look forward 10, 100, 1,000 years. If the scientific community concedes the principal belief that empiricism is the only valid form of obtaining universal truths, how are we meant to apply this selectively to religion when people like homeopaths or transphobes say, why can't our beliefs also be outside of the realm of scientific inquiry? How do you
Thank you very much. One, it's very interesting that you say that because science is by definition not moralistic. It can only make is claims, not should claims. So even if you prove that people who are homosexual are born homosexual, that tells us nothing about whether we should treat them equally. So science is never moral. I don't know where you were going with that argument. But secondly, even the most strident atheist of all time, Christopher Hitchens, said that religion will always exist. It's extremely unclear to me why religion just dissipates in their world. And thirdly, and most importantly, the burden is not on our side because you're defending status quo. We do have fucking science. We do have scientific discoveries. We do have peace within the scientific and religious community. So I don't know why something is dissipating away when you're literally defending the status quo that's so much better off. But the third part of Kira's extension I really want to talk about is who actually talks about this. Because I'm going to posit that most scientists tend to be apolitical. This has generally been true. Look at what's happening with the coronavirus. Most scientists have strayed away from criticizing the conservative government in the UK and similarly the Republican Party in the US, even though they've created a fucking mess in those places. Realistically, it's going to be the people who sort of make a buck on the side with these sort of things. It's going to be those new atheist types who have books to sell, who have podcasts to sell, something which Kira talked about. You legitimize their presence in public discussions, and these people have an incentive to say incendiary things. One, because they have to sell the books, but two, because that's what the media picks up. So even if these scientists are well-intentioned, the media will pick up something like scientists deliver scathing rebuke of religion, decimating Islam, or something, which just literally means, and even if that's not true, the media does it in the most objective way possible in some utopia. That's how people perceive it. What this means then is that you are legitimizing racial tropes against religious minorities. You're empowering the religious right, but crucially, missing the nuance from Kira's extension, you're literally providing them a recruiting tool. A lot of Pakistani kids find an escape in science because they can escape into science. You're literally forcing these kids to choose madrasas now because the science has been equivocated with atheism now and with loss of belief. I think that's a huge problem. Finally, weighing all of this and giving a meta observation of the debate. Truth can only mean truth if you justify why that's what truth means. Truth can mean utility. Truth can mean belief. We've given you reasons to cast doubt on the proposition that truth is the correspondence reality of truth. Secondly, from closing government's perspective, we've shown to you that if you do indeed have a duty to espouse your specific version of truth, you're isolating many members of your own community. Science and truth are subjective. And three, and much more importantly, the spread of truth is hampered in your world. Finally, in comparison to opening opposition, thank you for running my winning CEO case, but let's compare it to my current winning CEO case on the same motion. The reason that you don't win this on that comparative is because we talk about a larger net of people. A, every religious doctor and scientist who exists within the scientific community, but two, also the most vulnerable people. If anyone has ever needed science panel, it is the religious. And you're taking away science from an entire generation of kids because you're forcing them to make the most horrible personal choice they have ever made in their lifetimes. Don't let government win. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech, and thank you to all for the debate as a whole. Enjoy your break right now. I invite the judges to go to the adjudications room. And yeah, see you in some time.